I'm not a Snoop. Are some of you Snoops? Oh, it's really quiet. That's interesting. I smell guilt. I'm not a Snoop. I hate snooping. And I can tell you why. I think I can locate a moment when I learned I didn't want to be a Snoop. I actually snooped one time, and it was very much on accident. So I don't like to know what my Christmas gifts or birthday gifts are going to be. I really never have, not as a kid. I didn't go looking or anything, but one time on accident, I found my Christmas gift. It was my 15th Christmas. I was 15 years old. I was going to turn 16 the very next summer after this Christmas. And for those of you who have been 16 before, can you remember or think of what a 15-year-old boy might be singularly focused on at that point in his life? Driver's license. That's right. I was singularly focused on my driver's license. In fact, I started driver's ed before I was 15 and a half. I got my learner's permit on my 15 and a half birthday, and I got my driver's license on my 16th birthday. I did not want to have a single day of legal ability to be behind a wheel that I did not take advantage of. I was very excited about driving. And so Christmas was coming. It was November-ish of my 15th year of life. And I was looking for something. I don't even remember what I was looking for, but I was going all around the house looking for something. And I went down into my basement, and while I was looking for this, I noticed that there was like a box spring up against the part underneath the stairs in the basement. So you know how underneath stairs there's usually a carved out area? And I thought, well, that box spring isn't usually there. Maybe that's blocking what I'm looking for. So I walked over to the box spring and I moved the box spring and I looked underneath the stairs looking for whatever it was I was looking for, and I saw 2 bicycles. And I knew immediately that this was my Christmas gift. And I was overwhelmed with different feelings at that moment. One, I was pretty upset that it was not a car. Not that I expected to find a car I didn't expect to find any gift. I didn't even expect to get a car for Christmas that year. But a bicycle just a few months before getting my driver's license was not the sort of message that I was wanting to get. I also knew that my parents had saved up and put serious thought into this and wanted to make me happy with a Christmas gift. And so I felt really bad that my initial feeling was not joy, but instead saying, what am I going to use this for 6 months? I felt terrible. I didn't enjoy that at all. And then Christmas morning came, and I knew there was going to be a bike, and there was no surprise or wonder or excitement about what I was going to get that year. I had ruined Christmas in every way, shape, or form, even if I had done it on accident. And then pretending like I was excited and happy when I already knew what it was, that was a whole experience as well. If you just had to say, be happy the way that you're happy without being suspicious, you would have a hard time pulling that off. I had 2 long months to think about how I was going to do that and to make sure that I pulled it off. I wasn't trying to be a spoiled brat. I wasn't trying to be a Snoop. I wasn't trying to get ahead of what the gift was. But I had found my Christmas gift on accident, and it ruined all hope for Christmas. It was now spelled out for me. There were gifts that I longed for as a child, though, that my parents did deliver on. For example, I always wanted a video game system, and my mom refused to allow them in the house. I think she thought that they would rot my brains out. Jury's still out on whether or not that's true. But all of my friends had video game systems, a Nintendo or a Sega, a Game Boy, an Xbox, a PlayStation. I wanted in on the video games. I loved playing video games, and I had to go to my friend's house to play. And so I was hoping every single birthday and every single year through my childhood that one of those boxes would be a video game system. And it never was. Until my 17th Christmas, when finally my parents got me a used Sega Genesis. Listen, there was already PlayStations and Xboxes at this point. We had already moved on to the new, cooler games, but I didn't care. For the first time in my life, I had video games in my house. And it was pretty wild that I was 17. I was almost adult by this point. Turns out you can play video games when you're an adult too. But I was so excited to finally have my video game system of my own. There were so many other things that I hoped for as a child too. When I read the text this week, we've been talking about growing and each of these series of things, one thing to the next. The pinnacle of what Paul is talking about in our life is hope, having hope. And I began to think about the things that I've had hope for in my life, and I especially started landing on and thinking about the things that I hoped for when I was a kid. And I thought about how laughably different my life has turned out from a lot of those hopes, how much I nailed some of those hopes, how frivolous and silly some of those hopes seem, and how important some of those hopes have been fulfilled in my life. So some of the things I hoped for when I was a kid was that I hoped one day I would be a professional baseball player. That didn't work out. It just missed. I used to tell myself as a kid that I would play for 29 of the Major League Baseball teams. Any one of them but the New York Yankees. That was not a decision I ended up having to make. I didn't make it. I was not close. I hoped when I was a kid to get married someday. I did that. I hoped to have healthy and smart children. I did that. I hoped to be a millionaire. Still got a long ways to go. And frankly, I learned pretty quick into adulthood when I started signing papers for student loans that I probably was never going to make that millionaire goal. I hoped to graduate college. I did that. I also hoped to date Britney Spears. That also didn't happen. And I just want to be clear that when I say that, I'm talking about cute 90s teenager Britney Spears and not off her meds walking around in public restrooms in bare feet Britney Spears. Like, that was the day the dream died. No thank you. Some hopes come crashing back to reality really hard. Some of the things we hope for and long for are so beyond reality that there's no possibility that they would ever happen. And other hopes are small, intangible, and able to reach and to do. And the question as I think about the things that I've hoped for in life is, where did I get these ideas? Do I really want the things that I say that I hope for? How many of the things have we hoped for gotten and then found out that they were terrible ideas? Where does hope come from? What is it that we hope for? Where are our hopes created from? I heard this bit of wisdom this week from a friend. He was listening to a podcast and he shared this with me and it blew my mind and I wanted to share it with you. This is the question that was posed on the podcast. What would you want if you didn't know what others had? What would you want if you didn't know what others had? And I began to think that that's a pretty spot-on statement, that so often we only want things out of jealousy. Our hopes are longed not out of contentment, not out of maturity, but our hopes are often created in our more immature spaces, our places where we want more, where we can't define enough, and we begin to hope for things that we neither need and even things that we didn't necessarily knew existed. Our hopes are so often formed out of knowing what others have and wanting to keep up with them. And so today we consider this idea of hope. It's an important concept for Paul because Paul walked through a series of maturities and growths that he wrote about in Romans chapter 5 that come out of our suffering and our struggles and our conflict in life. And hope is the pinnacle of it. Hope for Paul is what we long for, what we're shaping towards out of our struggles. The text we've been reading is Romans chapter 5, verses 3 through 5. And just to remind you of that, I'm going to read this theme for us. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. And hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. Hope is the pinnacle. Hope is the crown. We have all suffered before. Some of us are suffering now. We have struggles, we have illnesses, we have brokenness, we have hurt, we have fear. And it's in those moments that Paul is saying God does great work on our behalf. And he does so because when we suffer, we learn to persevere. And while we're learning to persevere, it builds character with us. And if we're a Christian, this character that's built is what we learn by persevering while following and learning the ways of Jesus. Our character is formed into that of Jesus, which then allows us a hope that is tangible and eternal, and it's firm, and it's based in something that has happened and not just a wild projection of what could be. I've been fascinated across my life of stories of prisoners of war who have made it out of incredible suffering and torture. And the ones who endure this torture for a very long time, they usually speak about the same thing that has caused them to be able to make it through when many don't survive. The story that they tell is when they look back at the ones who were tortured and didn't make it, whether they died or commit suicide or they cracked or they broke, he said almost to a man or woman, they all give themselves arbitrary ends. They say things to themselves like, I can endure this until Christmas, or we will be saved by the end of winter, or they can't do this to us until next year. The hope that they're creating is not rooted in the actual reality that they are living. And so they create arbitrary endpoints, and they create a false perseverance for the struggles and torture that they're under. And when those days come, when sure enough, next spring arrives, or Christmas passes, or they continue to torture into next year, their will is broken because they have reached the end point of what they said that they can endure. And so the POWs that survive, that make it on the out on the other side, are the ones who took it a day at a time, who endured the suffering and built endurance and strength. They didn't imagine, they didn't make up arbitrary points at which they would be satisfied that they can make it. One day at a time, they suffered, and perseverance grew. We often do this with our own life when things are struggling. When we're hurting, when we're ill, we give ourselves arbitrary endpoints and they're disappointed when we don't make it. We say things like, I can endure this marriage until the kids leave. I can wait out the boss until he retires. I can be sad until the school year ends. We create arbitrary endpoints, and our perseverance is no more than the limits that we give to it. But in the midst of overwhelming suffering, we need to learn to persevere through it no matter how long it might be. That certainly builds character, but it also gives us hope. Because when we survive the trauma of the moment, we then can begin to realize that we can make it through the next struggle. We can make it through the next hurt. We can make it through the next season of suffering, through the next diagnosis or the next fear. And we do this because we recognize that Jesus has walked with us through the suffering. This is all to say that Christian hope is not just wishful thinking. It's not like hoping to win the lottery, no matter how long the odds are, because Jesus is in my favor. Christian hope is not wishful thinking. It is faith that's oriented to the future, knowing about the God of the past. Christian hope is based on God's already proven love to us. We have seen the love of Jesus, and so we know that he walks through us through the trials and the struggles of today. So the text we're going to read today is the greater context of what our theme verse has been. Because Paul teases this out even further than just these four movements that he's talking about. He teases it out by rooting it in the story of Jesus. This hope that we have is not arbitrary hope that something good will happen. It's rooted in an understanding of who God has always been, how God has revealed himself in Jesus, and how that gives us hope to endure the worst that this life could possibly throw at us. And the context of it is great as well. We'll read Romans chapter 5, 1 through 11 in just a moment. But the context of it is particularly helpful because it's not just about things are happening to us and that suffering has happened, but it's that God has gotten to the very root cause of the suffering in this world. And that is sin. Sometimes it's our own personal sin. We have done things to make our life more difficult. Sometimes it's the sin of others. They have done things to us to make our life feel unbearable at times. But God looks down upon this world that's so deeply infected by sin, by selfishness, by breaking of his commandments. He looks down upon all of this and sees how eventually you can be affected by sin, or you can choose to sin so often that it leads to overwhelming destruction, both in this life and in the life that is to come. The wages of sin is death. And when we participate and choose in sin, we are choosing death, both in this life and eternally. This is a separation of God, and sin causes us to choose that separation. It's no wonder when we choose sin over and over and over that we find ourselves entering into suffering and then being sufferers with no hope. The end of sin is death. And we're told in this text that God is angry at sin, that God doesn't passively look upon sin and think, oh, it's okay, oh, it's all right. God is furious at the choices that humans have made to turn our backs on God. This drives God up the wall because God has created us to be different, to be in relationship to him, to trust him, to follow him, to believe that listening to his command and his word and his way will lead us to a prosperous and good life, but we choose to turn our back on that. Now, if I were God, which it turns out I'm not, but if I were God, I would probably just give up on this group of people that I had created that just chose its own destruction over and over and over and over. But we're told here in the text that the heart of God is radically different than that, and that God acts definitively before we even shape up, that we might be saved from the destruction of our own choices. This context includes some of my favorite verses in all of the scripture, particularly the ones that come right after our theme verses, verses 6 through 8. But I want to read this because I think it's such a hopeful text about recognizing the state of our sin and how God acts in order that we might be saved. So I'm going to invite you to stand with me as we read these words.